So FromSoft has brought some exceptional strength faith weapons into this DLC, and the Black Steel Great Hammer is no exception. This weapon is incredibly fun and has a very unique guard counter, so we're going to get into the entire build, everything you need, and where to find everything in case you want to try this build out for yourself. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So there's a lot to talk about with this build, and we're going to get into that in just a second, but I want to show you exactly how the build works. Obviously, we're going to be using a mace and a shield in order to deal some decent damage, as well as have some really fun guard counter play, so you're almost like a hybrid holy tank. This is a really great build to use, especially if you're trying to get through the DLC, because shields pretty much negate anything being hard in the DLC at all. However, one downside that I've seen with a lot of guard counter builds is you absolutely have no ranged attacks, so you're forced to be up in the fray at all times. And although that can be great for guard counters, there also is another option. I'm adding Sacred Blade to this Black Steel Great Hammer in order to give us a little bit of range, and the way the Black Steel Hammer operates is if you buff it with holy damage, it will give you an extra holy damage buff on top of that, giving you some more overall damage. This is the only weapon that does this, so that's why we've chosen to buff it with this type of damage. Also be using some extra body and aura buffs, which I'll go over at the end of the video, and if you want to and have the Sword of Light, you can boost your holy damage up by an extra 20%, allowing these guard counters and the Great Hammer overall to just hit way harder. Now, before we get into the meat of the video, I do want to say there are going to be minor spoilers in this video for the first 2 to 3 bosses of the DLC, so just take note of that. But with all that being said and all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the weapon. So the Black Steel Great Hammer is going to have split damage between physical and holy, and the majority of the damage you're getting is going to be from the holy damage. We're going to have 226 plus 39 physical, and 330 plus 199 holy. It's going to have a strength scaling of D and a dex scaling of E with a faith scaling of C, and that's with the Sacred Affinity with Sacred Blade, and the attributes required are going to be 25 strength, 11 dexterity, and 17 faith. This weapon also does have a unique guard counter where it spreads a holy trail down on the ground that then explodes, and most of the time this will stagger your enemy, or it will cause them to stagger backwards so you can get another few hits on them before you put your shield back up. Another great thing about this weapon is it can be found immediately in the DLC when you first arrive. After you get to the gravesite Plain Sight of Grace, just run directly down the hill to the Church of Consolation. There will be a knight there, and after killing him, he will drop for you the Black Steel Great Hammer. I mentioned earlier that the Black Steel Great Hammer is going to allow you to get a further holy damage buff after you've buffed it with holy damage. However, this is not just putting a Sacred Affinity on the weapon. The only reason that this weapon has more holy damage after I've imbued it is because the Sacred Blade actually leaves a holy damage buff on the weapon. This will also work if you put holy grease on the weapon and decided not to use Sacred Blade, but that is what imbuement is. It's very different than the affinity of the weapon. Our second weapon is going to be the Black Steel Great Shield, and that's going to be received from the boss you're seeing me kill right here. I'll show you the map right now so you can know exactly how to get to this location, but he is the only enemy in the game that's going to drop this Great Shield. It's going to have a B scaling in strength, but the more important thing about it is it has 100% physical damage negation and really good stats overall. The guard boost is up at 77, so paired with some talismans, that's going to skyrocket even higher, and it's going to make you an absolute wall. Now, getting into our flask, we're using 2 tiers that benefit the build incredibly well. Because we are using guard counters and a shield, this allows us to take full advantage of the deflecting hard tier. This is a brand new tier within the DLC, and it provides a perfect parry system within this game. The second you're about to get hit, if you block, you're going to receive a little white spark as well as a different sound than you normally would, and that is how you know that you are about to do a perfect guard counter. You'll know you've done a perfect guard counter when your health does not move at all after the guard counter and your stamina bar moves minimally. You're also going to receive extra damage on your guard counter, stacking on top of another one of our talismans, which is going to be about roughly 20% for this particular tier. The next tier we're using is going to be the Holy Shrouding Crack tier, because this is going to give us a 20% increase in our holy damage, which we are going to be needing against a lot of these bigger bosses. Now, the Holy Shrouding Crack tier is going to be found in the northeastern section of Liurnia of the Lakes after you defeat the Minor Erd tree right here on the map, and the Deflecting Hard tier is going to be a little bit harder because you need to kill one of the Furnace Golems in order to do it. Luckily, it's going to be the Furnace Golem closest to the Scorched Ruins right here, and you can get this at the very beginning of the game if you have a little bit of patience and are really good at dodging fire stomps. Now, as far as the talismans, I kept flip-flopping between a few, and I've landed on these 4, but they can be changed out depending on the situation you find yourself in, so I will give you a few options. First off, we're using the Great Jar's Arsenal. This is pretty self-explanatory. We are using some pretty heavy equipment. That being said, we are going to need that plus 19% increased equip load, which is super nice to have. Next up, we have slot number 2, which is going to be the curved sword talisman, allowing our guard counters to have increased damage by 20%. And yes, this does stack with our deflecting hard tier, allowing for our guard counters, if done correctly, to hit for roughly 40%, which is ridiculous, and this is definitely needed for this build. Next up, we have the retaliatory cross tree. Now, this is one of the talismans I kept flip-flopping back and forth between because I found myself rolling a lot even though I was still using a shield. I know old habits die hard, but this is going to allow us to get a 17% increase in our damage after rolling, which is also a really nice buff to have. But if you decided that you were breaking stances more often than normal, you can definitely replace this with the dagger talisman, allowing you to get a 17% increase in your critical strikes. Or you can also use something like the Blade of Mercy, which is going to raise your attack power after each time you get a critical strike as well. All of those talismans I just mentioned are very viable for slot number 3, but because of the way that I play, the retaliatory cross tree talisman was definitely the way to go for me. Now, moving into slot number 4, we have the Great Shield talisman, and this is going to boost your guarding ability. What that means is it's going to reduce stamina damage taking while blocking by 20%. This is going to be extra important, especially when we are using our shield to block the main brunt of all the damage we are receiving, so we can get off these crispy guard counters. Now, the Great Jar's Arsenal talisman is going to be located right here on the map in Caelid after you defeat the 3 invaders for the Great Jar's Trial. The Curved Sword talisman is going to be found at the beginning of the game in Stormveil Castle, within a chest after you defeat the first Banished Knight in there you find. The Retaliatory Cross Tree talisman is going to be a quest reward from Lita when you do her quest line, and the Great Shield talisman is going to be found as soon as you get into Altus Plateau in a chest behind a carriage right here on the map. Now, the last thing we need to do before stats is talk about the buffs I'm using for this build. So I am using Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow, considering we do have the faith to do this, and this is a faith strength build. Flame Grant Me Strength is going to provide you plus 20% increased physical damage, as well as some extra fire damage, which we don't need. But Golden Vow is going to stack on top of that, giving you plus 10% extra damage and plus 15% extra damage negation. Having more damage negation is always nice because you'll take less damage, and adding those two buffs together, you're going to get a total of 35% increased physical damage, which is definitely solid for this build. Now, if you decide to do so, you can also use Beastal Vitality as well, giving yourself some passive healing over time while you're hiding behind your shield or recovering from taking a little bit of damage. I did think about using Howl of Shabriri with this build, but considering taking any extra damage in the DLC is pretty frowned upon, at least at this moment, I decided not to, even though you're going to get a decent damage boost. Lastly, let's go ahead and talk about the stats of the build. I'm rocking 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 35 Endurance, 35 Strength, Dexterity is at 11, 7 Intelligence, 50 Faith, and 11 Arcane. I found the 60 Vigor was absolutely essential for the DLC. Also, Endurance at 35 gives us a nice ability to medium roll when we have all of our gear on, as well as the Great Jar's Arsenal. 35 Strength is solely so we can wield the actual Great Hammer, and the Faith is where we're getting the majority of our damage from that Great Hammer as well. And that about wraps it up for our Black Steel Great Hammer build. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've really had a fun time playing with it. Going through guard counters has not been something I've done for a very, very long time, and it was quite refreshing to just hide behind that shield and then do immense amounts of damage, as well as learning how to use the deflect hard tier. That was a lot of fun as well. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for being here at the end of the video. Make sure to subscribe and like the video on your way out. And until next time, stay safe, enjoy the game, and I'll see you in the next one.